What's going on, everybody? Welcome to another talking video. Tonight, we're going to talk about uh, oil pressure with your M96 or my M96 in a 996 non turbo, non GT car. This topic was requested by my buddy Randy. Randy's a super good guy, so when he asks you to, to do him a solid, you oblige. So, thanks for the input. I think it's a pretty good topic, one that I've covered couple instances in the past, but I think we'll get a little bit more in depth with what I know now or my opinions. So let's get some disclaimers out of the way. I'm not an engineer. Um, I don't, what I've learned has basically been from people who were smart enough to pass it along, who I chose to listen to, or research I've done on my own. So I'm not an engineer. And the experiences and results that I'm going to talk about are mine. Your car may be completely different. You may not have any problems that I have, or you may have problems that are much worse. So, just to get the argumentative aspects out of the way, that's all my opinions. So, starting at the start. So, I, like a lot of people, get a cool car, sports car, want to take it onto the track. So, where do you go to find information on the preparation you should do for that? You go to forums, you go to articles specific to your make, your preference, and try to soak those things up and understand what the do's and the don'ts are. So, Renless has been a good resource for me. Certainly one that I like to contribute to today with topics like the one that we're going over, as also with a lot of experience from people that have lived and made mistakes long before I did and were nice enough to publish them in the hopes that other people wouldn't repeat. Um, so, uh, Specific to this engine, everybody will talk about the IMS, and, you know, that's for a topic for another video probably. Uh, but specifically, what we're covering is the oil system. So the AOS, the air oil separator, and then the sump and baffle within the motor. You'll read places on the internet, popular vendors like LN Engineering relay that you need to run oil level at a specific point below full, so that it doesn't overwhelm the AOS system. That's something that I think Porsche had originally said, a long time ago, and that the more sticky tires you run, the faster you go, the more pervasive that problem can be of overwhelming the AOS. So these are topics that you can go and research further and see some of the sources that have contributed to the general knowledge of, hey, if you want to go run your 996 at the track, here's what you do. But I'll sum it up in kind of a generality, and that's, you want to get a deep sump. The deep sump is going to allow you to put more oil in the car, and generally they come with a baffle that's better than stock. That baffle will serve to keep oil where it's supposed to be, which is at the pickup, so that under the vast majority or all conditions, the pickup stays submerged in oil and you at no point suffer any instances where the pickup becomes uncovered and air is picked up. And the method with which we can see that through um, our instruments is through a pressure loss or a pressure drop within the motor. Um, so that's what they say that you should do. And, that's what I did, more or less. Ran the oil at a half full and bought the deep sump. And pretty early on, I noticed that I had pressure drops that were reflective just on the gauge. I didn't know to the extent of how bad they were until I acquired some data collection, because I'm kind of a vindictive prick. So when people say, like, hey, go do this and these will be the results, and I'm dumb enough to just listen to it and then find that, nope, that's not the results I get it like that goes up my ass. So I wanted to go and say, all right, I can't really, with a lot of granularity, go and explain to people what it is that I'm seeing unless I have some pretty um, inarguable data to point to and say, here's what it is. So, a twofer in my case was I wanted a data system to be able to work on myself as a driver, start to learn how that works, but also to monitor the vitals of the equipment. So oil pressure and oil temperature, obviously, right up there. And what I found very rapidly was, yeah, there were huge pressure drops all the time. Uh, there'll be a link in the description to a thread on Runlist where I had finally accumulated enough of this data to be able to point it out. And you'll see in the videos that I post. And if you go back in history, you'll see those as well, since the data system has been in play. The oil pressure, oil temp, coolant temp, those are all displayed on the screen. The reason for that is so that people can see exactly what's going on my setup on that given day with the parts that I've run. So that's kind of the baseline. And I would encourage people to go and read through that thread. It's a really long one, but there's contributions from a lot of people who are very widely respected within the world of working on these engines, not just in 911s, but in Boxsters as well, where I think the use case as far as racing and data collection goes is more prevalent than it is in the 911 world, to be frank. The cars are not worth as much money. So I think you find a lot more people who are willing to take them out on track. And there's also a much broader base of competition on the Boxster side with spec Boxsters, unlike what you see with this generation 996, where the competitive racing is not as prevalent, and therefore you don't see as much investment in things like data collection for people that are just going to go and beat their cars up at the track. So kind of the opinions that I formed over my course of going through this journey of trying to improve what to me was a situation that was, it was unfortunate that the parts that I got didn't do what I thought that they were going to do. And I had conclusive data to be able to show the situations, both the video as well as the actual data, which the data that I've collected is available to anybody. Anybody that would like to see that can feel free to request it. The software, Race Studio from AIM, is free to download. So if anybody wants to play around with that, I'm happy to send you logs. I have a buddy, Paul, on the Renlist forum, and if you take the time to go look at that thread that I linked to below, you'll see some of his data breakdowns. They're awesome. They're done in a way that's pretty intuitive to understand, and they paint a picture that most times squiggly lines really don't do very well for the average person. This breaks them down along with his commentary in a way that makes it pretty understandable, I would say. So my opinions. What I have found is that there has been a measurable improvement in the stability of my oil pressure related to oil level. So let's simplify this. The more oil that's in the sump, the better my oil pressure. So it sounds kind of stupid when you say it out loud, like, yeah, duh, no shit it is. But remember, the prevailing recommendations from people like LN Engineering and supposedly Porsche themselves, although I've never actually seen anything from Porsche that I'd say was official that says, hey, don't run full oil, was run at no more than half a tank or half of the sump capacity. So I said, eventually, with the combination of parts, which I'll go over a little more in a minute, as that oil level started increasing, what was reflected was a clear improvement in the depth of the pressure drops that we would see. So whereas they would fall to 20 psi, now they may fall to 35. So that's an improvement. Now, what allowed me to get there, and I think probably if I was to go and say the singular most important modification that I've done to the car in the powertrain is a combination of the UAOS, that is the modified air oil separator that places a reservoir inline in the system, and that coupled with what's called the I don't remember. Skip will probably be mad. I don't remember what the name of it is, but I call it a drain back. And for all intents and purposes, what it is it's a tube that connects to the drain plug on the UAOS reservoir and drains that oil that would otherwise collect in the reservoir back into the oil fill tube and thus into the sump. So you close the loop pretty effectively on that system and give more pathways for the oil to return to the sump than would otherwise be with a stock system or with the AOS standalone. What I found prior to that was my engine has a lot of blow by, and I was seeing a ton of oil collect. And if I ran, half I'm speaking somewhat in jest because I don't remember and don't have the data in front of me, but the data's in that thread if you want to go back and look at. But for conversation purposes, we'll say if I ran half capacity on oil, I'd get a ton of blow by and I'd fill up that reservoir and eventually started filling up subsequent reservoirs that I attached before this drain back had been invented. And if I ran a little bit lower, I wouldn't get as bad blow by, but the oil pressure drops would be huge. And sometimes what I would see was over the beginning of a day or a session where the oil was still pretty full, I'd get a ton of blow by, but the oil pressure would start off okay because again the capacity is a little higher, and then towards the end of the session, the oil pressure starts to suck. Well, that's because that oil has now been placed in the reservoir or overfilled the reservoir and started to get burned in the intake. So the level has dropped in the sump. So it was just a battle, constant battle to try to make the car go faster, get better as a driver, and deal with this keeping the oil in the sump thing. It was a nightmare. So again, for me, the most important thing why this engine is still in this car is because of that modification. Now my oil level stays consistent. It doesn't burn any oil, so whatever's being brought up into the reservoir is immediately drained back into the sump, and it keeps the oil level consistent. All right, so what that allowed me to do subsequently, realizing that, wow, now I don't lose any oil either having to drain it from the sump and toss it away, and I don't lose it with it going through the reservoir or overfilling the reservoir and going into the intake and burning it. Now I can start to run more oil. Now I don't have to be chained to this in order to not overwhelm the AOS. You have to run less. Fuck it. Now if I'm just going to close the system and it's going to dump back into the sump, I can run more. And in that thread is a good reflection on how I have stepped up the oil capacity in my engine over time, and the oil pressure results have gotten better, not solved, but better. So there is a tie that's obvious and data proven on my car, my setup, my driving, that says the more oil you run, the better your oil pressure is going to be. So if I was to make a suggestion, I think the most important modification you could do in the oil system for running your M96 on the track, in my opinion, is that UAOS and the drain back. I would do that personally before I put a deep sump on or any of that. I think that allows you to run an oil level much closer to capacity, if not, like in my case at this point, over capacity. And that will go the furthest to minimizing your oil pressure drops of anything that's available today. When we talk about my specific setup and where it stands today, the last track day that I ran, which that video is up, the car had 11 and 3/4 of a quart of oil in it. So almost a full case. That's up probably a quart and change from where I started this whole adventure. And I think that I can still go up higher. So a huge difference, and this is no smoke on startup, no oil consumption, just a huge difference with being able to get that oil draining back into the sump. So I guess the where we stand currently is, short of market available products that will do a better job at the real problem, which I'm going to speak to in a minute, is put more oil in it. Any methods that you can use to increase the depth of the pickup in the sump of oil is a good thing to do. At least it has shown in my case through the data that I've collected to be a good thing to do. That being said, the problem as I see it is any drop in oil pressure that's induced by something like by an external force, so by cornering or braking or whatever, that indicates to me that that drop is because at some point the pickup has either started to A, pick up oil that's over aerated, or B, pick up air. So I think it's important to remember with regards to oil is that we read oil pressure, but the oil pressure is really a proxy for flow. What we really care about is that there is a constant oil flow through the engine, and that drop in pressure, in the case of it being caused by an external force, indicates a drop in oil flow as much as it does the drop in pressure. And that, I think, is something that, as I started to think about it after it was relayed by someone on the Renless forum, has got me really on this kick that any drop in pressure is going to be something that is likely to cause damage. It's going to be likely to cause damage because you are seeing an indication that there is air taking the place of oil within the system, and that air will go someplace. So as we move through the oil system and the oil gets picked up from the sump and it runs through the pump and it runs through the oil filter where my pressure sensor and temp sensors are both located, goes up from the oil filter up into the oil cooler and then immediately down from the oil cooler into the heart of the motor to the main bearings and the subsequent rods and so on and so forth. Air that's introduced will likely go someplace within the engine, and any area that's receiving forced pressure fed oil is receiving it because it is a requirement for engine health. So if we are dispersing some of that oil with air, that's obviously a bad situation. So for me, this is kind of a black and white. Like, it's fixed, as in the only time pressure drops is when it drops in relation to RPM, and that's because of the pump speed, is okay. That's it. Any other time that you're seeing pressure drops is one that should try to be resolved. And there are tons of cars, different applications where you can go and look at the difference between a dry sump fed engine and a sump fed engine, regular pickup. And, I think what I am looking for is I want dry sump performance. That would, to me, is what is required for me to say, yep, the problem is fixed. I no longer have to worry about air being introduced into the oil system and possibly making it to a place where it needs to be fed with oil, but instead it's getting fed with oil and air, or aerated oil. So I don't know that we'll get there, short of really smart people that are motivated to go and do this, doing it themselves. I don't think that there's a viable commercial case for a deep sump, or a dry sump rather, system to be developed for these engines. So absent a commercial viable case, that there's no reason for someone to develop one other than for their own use. And, I think that's probably happened and we don't know about it, or it's happened for, we know it's happened in the Boxster world with Chris Cervelli's motors running dry sumps that he developed, but doesn't, I don't think at least intends to market or develop further for the 911 platform. I don't know. I hope to be proven wrong on that, but, I think that this is just one of those things where the motor can probably survive in a state of moderating the instability to a large effect. I think for the most part, the motors are pretty reliable on track, and likely, if I had to guess how this one will go, it will be over time. We see wear on the bearings caused by this insufficient or unstable oil supply, and you see a rod let go, because the bearing spins and the thing welds itself to the crankshaft and then breaks. I don't know. But I think that's a pretty likely outcome. And I think plenty of these engines, either in 911s or Boxsters, have reached an eventual outcome, something similar to that. Oil cooling has been one thing that I glanced over. So in the data, it shows, yeah, if your oil's very cool, it greatly minimizes the pressure drops. Um, Probably because the viscosity of that oil that is so much cooler than what I would call regular operating temps for my use case, like 220 to 240, 245 ish is generally what I'm going to see. We're talking oil temps in like the 180s, 190s that make a real meaningful difference on oil pressure. Um, you're not going to cool the oil to 185 degrees. I won't on this car and where I run. So there is no pathway to oil cooling that fixes this problem in any real meaningful way. I think oil cooling's a fine thing. It's not something I would go spend money on. Like, I haven't went and spent money on additional water cooling right now because the temps don't dictate that it's a requirement. And using cooling as a band-aid method to try to fix oil pressure, to me, is a fool's errand. The results that I've seen trying to keep more oil in the car have yielded much better benefits in real world scenario than I think you'll see with cooling the oil if your target is something that to me doesn't seem like it would be achievable. And that's what that 185 or whatever it was there in the thread too. You can see him if you do, if you go and read it, where the temps have to be for your pressure to not have these instabilities. To me, it's a good thing. Oil cooling's great, but I don't think if you're talking about it in relation to fixing this issue, it's the best way to go. And it's certainly, there's not a lot of ways to do it without adding a lot of complexity to the system. If you want to add external coolers or shit like that, you're talking about running oil lines to places where they don't currently live. And that not only creates a lot of complexity, but now what are you asking the oil pump to do? You asking it to drive oil, 10 more feet through lines and coolers. Um, yeah, I don't know. I'd like to see something come out, but I'm just not sure for me that it's something that coexists within this topic of resolving the oil pressure. I just think it's a good thing to do in and of itself, just like additional water cooling would be, but not in relation to it's going to fix your oil pressure issue. In my opinion, the cars are really pretty reliable on track, and I think a lot of the um, detrimental or negative commentary about them is related to things that don't seem to be as prevalent on the track. But I will say, the fact that the motors cost 20 fucking thousand, 25,000, $30,000, um, you know, if you just get the car and you want to go and play around with it and you want the thing to live a long, happy life, it's a big risk to take the thing out to the track, especially when hey, if it has shitty oil pressure, some guys can run with it forever, other guys can't. It's a big gamble to take. And I think the bummer of the platform with regards to that is it's so good on track. The chassis is so good, that the fact that it has an inherent issue like that hasn't really been effectively resolved by the aftermarket. So it's not like, yeah, there's an option, but it's really expensive. It's like, I don't know that there is an option. I don't know that there's an option that exists, period, unless you wanted to say that you were going to go pay someone to build you a custom dry sump. There isn't a lot of any really parts that I know of that I'd say go far enough along in the development and success path to be like, yes, you can tell any guy, put this on, you should be fine at the track, oil pressure should be fine. The drain bag is probably the closest thing to that I think that exists right now. But yeah, there's just big consequences if you lunch the motor because of something like this, and it's not like you go pull another one out of a junkyard for $3 grand or $5 grand. It's like, yeah, they're super expensive, and you know I would like to say that because they're so expensive that was enough of an impetus for someone to go and develop something to fix it. But the reality is that most of the people that bought these cars don't have the money to go and put new motors in them if they blow up, and they didn't have the money to buy a nicer Porsche, and that's why they bought this one. So trying to go and sell those $5,000, $6,000 dry sumps to those guys, yeah, that isn't fucking happening. Um, so while I am doubtful a solution will ever be had for this particular problem, I do think that there's room for improvement, and I hope that smart people decide that there is enough of a market for them to turn a profit to build something that actually works. And I don't mean it works like we put on our website, yeah, it works. I mean, like, yeah, it works. And here's the data, and here's the video, and here's the car we use, and here's the testing that we did. Like if you're going to say it works, make sure it fucking works. Because I spent $900 on the thing, whatever. It sucks. And maybe it improves what would otherwise be a worse situation on the deep sump thing. But the reality is, I guess your definition of work may be, yeah, it still has huge pressure drops all over the place, which maybe that's what LN's definition of work was, or maybe it's just my car that has this issue. I don't know. But it would be nice for, as if future iterations of mechanical things to resolve this issue come out, that people are willing to go, yeah, we ran it with real data collection and real use cases, and here's what it does. So I think I will probably end it on that. This has been another long talking video, but I hope it's on a topic that interests most of you. So that's it. If you have any questions or comments, leave them here or go and post them in the Renless thread. Hopefully we'll be able to get that thread back up and a little more lively. And if you're someone that collects data, you run these cars at the track and you collect data and you have more to contribute, then yeah, I saw this, or it would be hugely beneficial for the community, I think, if more people were willing to go out and collect data on what their setup does and what their parts are, and we could have more hooks in the water to try to find better combinations that yield results than we currently have, at least in that thread. So thank you all for watching. If you like the kind of technical, non-engineer technical videos, let me know, and let me know some topics that you want to be covering, and I'm happy to share my opinions on them. But for now, that is the video. So thank you for watching. Have a good night, and we'll see you in the next one.